All right, let's journey back to the 17th century and get inside the mind of a Puritan thinker named Isaac Ambrose. He was wrestling with this massive question. How could anyone possibly find salvation before Jesus actually showed up? His answer was this incredible spiritual roadmap he called the Covenant of Grace, and that's what we're going to unpack today.
So, Ambrose doesn't kick things off with hope. Not at all. He starts with a complete catastrophe. With this one sentence, he sets the stage. The entire human story is a crisis. This wasn't just some small mistake, it was the literal undoing of man, a spiritual disaster so total that it doomed every single soul from the very beginning. This is the problem that desperately needs a divine solution. So, yeah, let's start right where Ambrose does, with what he calls the world's saddest act. His whole point is that to really get the cure, you first have to understand just how bad the disease is. And for him, that disease started way back with the fall of Adam. Now, this is where Ambrose makes an ancient event feel incredibly personal. He basically argues that we were all, in a sense, right there in Adam. His failure wasn't just his own problem. It became our shared inheritance. His sin, his punishment, it all became ours. We were, as he puts it, undone before we were even born. Okay, so from that point of total, absolute crisis, Ambrose introduces a glimmer of hope. I mean, if humanity was undone by one single act, then maybe, just maybe, it could be saved by another. And this is where he brings in his main event, the divine lifeline he calls the Covenant of Grace.
So what exactly is this Covenant of Grace? Well, you can think of it like a sacred contract, right? A binding promise from God to humanity. And the really crucial part is that its foundation, the guarantor from day one, is Christ. This is the mechanism, the only way a fallen world could ever find its way back to God.
And right here, this is where the stakes become crystal clear. Look at the left side. That's the soul after the fall, undone, damned, hiding in fear. But on the right, a total 180-degree transformation. Through this covenant, that very same soul can be reconciled, offered salvation, and become a child of God, filled with hope. The contrast is just absolute.
But here's the thing. This covenant wasn't just dropped out of the sky in a single flash of light. Ambrose describes it more like a promise that unfolded slowly, gradually, over all of human history, kind of like a mystery being solved one clue at a time.
Ambrose traces this trail of breadcrumbs through history. It all starts with Adam, just a faint hint of a future victory. Then with Abraham, it gets serious. It becomes a formal, personal covenant. With Moses, God reveals something new about himself, that he is all-sufficient, everything we need. By the time we get to King David, the promise is described as everlasting and totally certain. And then, finally, through the prophets, the whole thing moves inward. It's not just an external rule anymore, but a law written directly on the human heart.
But for Ambrose, knowing the history, that's only half the battle. Not even. See, knowing the timeline isn't enough. So he pivots from this grand story of history to the intimate, personal landscape of the human soul. He argues that every single person has to walk their own internal path to grab hold of this promise for themselves.
And he lays out this 5-step path. It all starts with just consideration, really meditating on God's promise. And as the soul does that, that consideration grows into an intense desire. This desire then builds a solid foundation for a confident hope, which gives the soul the guts to take the most important step of all, to believe. And the inevitable result of this whole journey? A complete outpouring of love and joy. Let's focus on that second step, desire, because it's critical. For Ambrose, this is not some mild preference. It's a desperate, soul-deep cry. It's the feeling of a person who has finally realized they're completely lost and sees only one possible rescue. It's a thirst so deep, the soul literally feels like it will die without Christ. So why Jesus? Why is he the one and only object of this desire? Because inside this covenant, he plays every single crucial role. He's the messenger who brings the news, the witness who confirms it's true, the surety who guarantees the deal, the mediator who bridges the gap, and even the testator whose future death would seal the whole thing. He is, as Ambrose puts it, the all-in-all.
This intense desire naturally builds into hope. But listen, for Ambrose, this is not just wishful thinking. It's not crossing your fingers. It is a confidence built on actual evidence. The soul is supposed to look inward and ask some hard questions. Am I seeing signs of this promise in my own life? Am I actually changing? Is this thing for real in me?
And that hope is what leads to belief. But where does that belief even come from? Well, this is one of Ambrose's most powerful, most jarring images. He says true faith doesn't grow in the nice, comfortable soil of self-satisfaction. No. It only blooms in the soul that has stared into the abyss of its own lostness and finally recognized its desperate need for a savior.
And here we hit a really crucial point in Ambrose's thinking, one that kind of cuts against how we often think today. For him, believing is not mainly a feeling, it's an action. It is obedience to a direct command from God. He argues that God's command to believe is way more powerful than any of your personal feelings of doubt, fear, or unworthiness. You don't wait until you feel worthy. You believe because you've been commanded to.
So what's the end of the line? What's the final outcome of this entire intense journey? For Ambrose, it's an emotional response that just flows naturally from belief. He says, when a soul truly gets the depth of God's love in this covenant, the only possible reaction is to love back and to be just filled with this overwhelming joy.
And finally, this whole internal journey has to show up on the outside. Knowing about the covenant isn't the finish line. The actual goal is a life that is completely transformed by it, a life that starts to look more and more like Jesus.
So what does that look like in practice? Well, it's a life of mirroring. God freely offers this covenant, so we have to freely embrace it. God is always faithful in keeping his promises, so we have to try our best to be faithful in our commitment. God honors us by calling us his people, so we have to live our lives to honor him. It's a reflection. And really, that's what this all boils down to. The entire process, from understanding the fall, to tracing the promise through history, to that inner journey of the soul, it's all a spiritual technology designed for one single purpose: total transformation. It's about being reshaped, remade in the image of Christ.
And so Ambrose gives us this amazing, intricate roadmap for a soul trying to find its way to God, all based on the promise of a Savior who hadn't even arrived yet. It was a framework for looking forward, which leaves us with a really fascinating question, right? What happens to this whole path when the promise actually becomes a person? What changes when Jesus finally shows up in the flesh?